Kia ora. Welcome everybody to the last webinar of this year. Today's webinar will be looking at what came out of our user group meeting last week. So a recap of the different topics that were covered by our speakers around the theme of accessibility. So I've gone back through the presentations that we did in the user group meeting, and I've pulled out different tips that have come out of each of those. And some of those I'll be able to show things back in Vernon Browser or Vernon CMS that tie into those talks. One of the things that we've been working on is recording all of the sessions from the user group meeting. And so that's provided to end users via our Vernon CMS YouTube channel. So you can just do a Google search for Vernon CMS YouTube and you'll find our channel. We can see that as of this week, Penny has finished the editing and captioning of the different sessions that were part of the user group meeting. So if you or any of your colleagues weren't able to attend any of those sessions, then this is an opportunity for you to go and watch those edited versions. In our user group meeting, the first client talk we had was from Magella Care at Maitland City Council. So she gave a presentation about how their organisation are taking diverse collections from around the city and cataloguing and presenting on the browser those collections together. A key part of that for them has been the digitisation. One of the things that's really streamlined things for them has been creating a dedicated photography area. So they've got a permanent room set up for photographing the objects in the best possible way. And we highly recommend that for streamlining your photography process. Even if it's as simple as setting aside a particular desk for smaller objects in the collection so that you can more quickly photograph those in the best possible conditions. So permanently set up a white backdrop with lighting that you know works, and then you'll be much more able to quickly photograph objects of the size that fits within that space. And here we can see some photos of that photography area that Maitland have set up. A key thing for them was the user experience when engaging with the collections. Two challenging areas for them were access to particular objects where you needed high resolution images to be able to use them effectively. An example of that would be their plans and maps collection. And another area was things where they needed to create flippable PDFs. So multi-page documents where they wanted to be able to share those with users on Vernon Browser and make that content fully accessible. So their site's available through Collections Maitland, nsw.gov.au. And on that homepage, we can see the 5 or 4 at the moment. They're working on a 5th, which is about to launch. So the 4 collections that are currently available. Those are reasonably independent organisations within their city boundaries. If I searched on the entire collection, we can see that we always have a filter on the left to look at only the collections of one of those organisations. So if you had a particular client, a particular end user that's interested in a museum that's close to them, they can quickly hone in just on that particular collection. If I did a quick search for maps, for example, we can have a look at one of the examples of their higher resolution photography. So this particular map, we can already see that it's very difficult to use that effectively at this scale. And so this is an example of an item in their collection where they've scanned it at a much higher resolution so that we're then able to click on that and zoom in further, and we can get down to the detail of individual properties on that historic city map, see the addresses and see the property boundaries. And that's only possible by them thinking about the quality that they're creating in those images that link back to Vernon. And so these are the 5 collections that they're initially working on. 4 of those are currently live, and they're currently working on the hospital collection. I'll swap to Vernon CMS with our demo collection, and we can see some of the features that they've used to make those divisions possible. Firstly, we saw an example of PDFs wanting to be shared online. They've linked those PDFs in Vernon through the document references page. So this is just our demo collection rather than their objects. But we can see an example here where I've got a couple of different external links. They've uploaded their PDFs to the Vernon browser server, and from there they're just web links with a category marked as public web link. And when we're publishing their object record to their Vernon browser site, we're then filtering the content from this external file field so that only the public references are available. They're making use of the department field to create those broad collection level categories for the Maitland Regional Gallery, for instance, and the hospital collection. And because we've then got consistent terms that categorize those objects, we can present those as filters to the end users so that they can hone in on exactly the records they're interested in. We can see an example of one of those PDFs once it gets published. I'll just search for all the records that have a PDF reference. And there we can see they've currently got 18 different scans of mostly book type material. So I could click on any one of those. And again, we can see from the image that that's only giving us a particular view of the object. In their case, they've created sometimes several images of key pages in those documents. So here we have an example of what one of the plans within that book looks like. But more importantly, they've uploaded their PDF scan and they've labeled that field as related information. So that's what's coming from that external file field back in Vernon. And I can click on View Item PDF and then access that PDF which exists on the Vernon browser server. And then I've got a full page-by-page view of that entire document, which will have a number of different plans, and we can now see them in detail page by page. So that's an example of some of the things that they've considered both at the digitization step and when they're sharing those collections online to make that content as accessible as possible. The next talk that we had was from Stace Robinson, and so he was representing Arts Access Aotearoa and talking about different ways that we have to consider accessibility both to our building and our collections and the events that we create as part of our organisation. He gave us some great tips on getting started with accessibility, including just identifying what you already have in terms of digital resources and physical spaces, and then thinking about how you provide access to those different things. That can be done through action plans, identifying things that should be addressed, maybe concentrating on the easiest changes first, and then also implementing policies so that you're thinking about these things going forward as you make changes within your organisation, both with basic collection management and with front of house activities like exhibition areas and events. He gave us tips on how we can become more accessible. So thinking about access for deaf people that are visiting our organisations, thinking about audio descriptions for people that have sight impairment, and thinking about special times where you're giving access to people that may have particular requirements when they visit an organisation. So for instance, people that have ADHD may need quiet spaces to get the best enjoyment of your collections when they visit them in person. So a simple change would be having a dedicated hour or two within the week where it's marked as a quiet time for people that would prefer that environment when they come and visit you. As part of the information he shared, he pointed us to their website, and that has a huge amount of resources that you can make use of. So under the Arts Access Aotearoa site, we can go to their information hub. Within there, there's sections like funding information, where you can get funding to help you do projects that improve accessibility, and a whole lot of external resources. So for instance, within the funding information, we can find a whole lot of resources, mostly New Zealand-based, since they're a New Zealand-based organisation, but there are equivalents in Australia. And those sources are things where you could look at a particular project where you're wanting to improve the way your organisation does in a specific way. There was also the resources that I mentioned, and that includes a whole lot of different ways that we can meet accessibility guidelines. So for instance, Creative New Zealand have put out an arts toolkit that gives a whole lot of different tips and suggestions. If I visited their website, one of the things that they do, for instance, is give a whole lot of example projects. So that's a great resource when you're thinking about implementing things like a new exhibition or a new public program. You can look at what other people have done before and see what might be possible for your organisation with the budget and resources that you have. The next presentation we had was from Tessie Scott. They were looking for a way to promote the new version of Vernon Browser that they'd implemented to represent the 3 collections from the medical and dental collections within the University of Melbourne. And they came up with the concept of a collection treasure hunt. They set aside money for prizes and then came up with a series of clues that people had to solve to find specific items within the collections that they put online. So that was encouraging people to make use of the search filters that were available within Vernon Browser to access the tens of thousands of items that they've shared online. They've also made use of Google Analytics to study what result came out of that treasure hunt. And they were able to clearly show that there was a huge impact on visitation of the site due to the treasure hunt being run. So a lot more, particularly students in their case, discovered the website and are now making use of that as a resource as part of their studies at that university. So as I noted, they represent 3 smaller museums that are within the university. So all with a science background. There's the Medical History Museum, the Dental Museum, and the Museum of Anatomy and Pathology. Again, they've made use of the department field within Vernon to create those broad categories. And so users can quickly jump into records that fall into just one museum's collection. And that's one example of the filters that they used in their clues. If I looked at the first set of clues they gave and give an example of how that led to a particular collection item, they gave a clue of a foot that wasn't what you would expect. And that was part of the Museum of Anatomy and Pathology. And they gave suggested clues as to how we could narrow down to that particular item. And those clues were looking for only things where there was an image online, looking for things that were specifically models within their collection, and looking for things where comparative anatomy was one of the categories. And that was enough to end up with a result set of only 16 items from which we can then scan through, and we'd be able to find, in their case, the particular plaster cast of a chimpanzee foot that matched what they were looking for in that week of the treasure hunt. So that was an innovative way to help people explore the collection online and discover that that resource had a wider range of things than perhaps the students were aware of before doing the treasure hunt. The next talk we had was from Mary Dawn from Te Ahu, which is the Museum of the Northland region of New Zealand. She gave us a great recap of how the cataloguing standards and collection management had evolved at their organisation over the decades. This is an example of what level the cataloguing was at in the 1990s. So it was still paper-based. It had evolved to the point of having a fairly standardised form, but they didn't have digital access to the collection in any way. So that information had limited use. It could only really be accessed by the staff directly working at the organisation, and it wasn't searchable in the way that we can do now with modern collection management systems. This is an example of the end use that they were able to create using both Vernon CMS to improve the cataloguing and Vernon Browser to present the results of that. We can see the quality of the photography that they've done as part of this digitisation work. And we can see the detail in our recording at the individual collection item level. We'd strongly recommend that individual sites create their own cataloging standards to get the best result of their digitization work. One example of that kind of standard is one we created for a collection of eHive users, and that's available through the Vernon Systems website. So that's an example that you could follow if you were creating cataloging standards for Vernon CMS within your organization. So for example, this particular standard covers each of the fields that the catalogers are expected to make use of and gives clear examples of the type of information that should be entered into each of those fields. That standard is also making use of the features in the product, like creating term lists. So within Vernon, you can put a lot of effort into creating clear authority term lists, and that will improve both the speed of the cataloging once those term lists have been created in the system, and the future searchability of those collections, because you know you can consistently search across a wide range of items that have the same term allocated to them. In both of those projects, they've been able to make use of Google Analytics as a way of seeing what the outcome of that work has been. So we saw the slide from the University of Melbourne. University of Melbourne found that Google Analytics was key for them to see whether the treasure hunt concept actually made a difference. Google Analytics is integrated by default into Vernon browser. You just have to create a free account on your end to be able to track those visitor statistics. So here's what Google Analytics looks like on a typical website. This is just showing the current live stats for our eHive website. Some examples that you can see within Google Analytics are, where does our audience come from? We can see, for instance, that the 5 most popular countries are the 5 countries which most predominantly use eHive for their cataloging. But we can also drill into other details, like what web browser are they using and what operating system. Information like that is important for us as a development company, because we can see whether a particular operating system, for instance, is no longer widely in use, and we therefore don't need to necessarily support it as we implement new versions of things like Vernon browser. We can also see how we acquired each of these different visitors, or how they came to our website. So if I click on the overview, unsurprisingly, a web search is the most predominant way that people are finding their way to eHive. And that's true of all collection sites. You'll have a huge number of pages there. And if the site has been developed well, those pages will be easy to discover through a web search, through products like Google. And so we can see that around 80 to 90% of the visitors are coming specifically through a web search. Some are coming through other methods, like directly typing in the website name, like eHive.com, or coming from a post on social media that referenced that particular site. Lastly, we can see what kind of behavior the users are exhibiting on the site, particularly what kind of content are they browsing through and how long are they staying on those different pages. And that's important for understanding what things the users are honing in on, what things are they particularly interested in, because that can help you shape what digitization you do in the future. For example, I can look and see what are the most popular pages within eHive. Surprisingly, in the last month, the most popular page on the entire site has been a 1952 photograph of flooding in New South Wales. If I drilled into that particular page, we can see that that page wasn't visited at all for almost the whole month, but suddenly in the last week, it's been frequently visited. And we can tie that directly to the fact that there is currently flooding in New South Wales, so people are searching for that term, and they're finding this historic image to compare the current floods to. It may even be the case that this is an image which is now publicly available, so it has no copyright anymore, and that news agencies may be using this photograph as a historic comparison. The next presentation we had was from Penny Collins at Vernon Systems, just showing the work that we do to create web content that is accessible. She had a number of different tips for writing, and that included creating unique page titles. That does tie back to the cataloging in Vernon CMS, because things like Vernon Browser have a page title for each object record within your organization. And so you can think about how you write the text in a field like the name title field, so that that's going to be clear and easily accessible on the web. So you're trying to create informative and unique titles. We're also trying to use those headings to convey the structure of the page and clearly break it down in a way that makes sense to the end user. We're also wanting to link between pages of relevant content, and we want to make the link text, the part of the text that is underlined or styled in a way so that people know they can go somewhere else. We want to make that link text clear and meaningful on its own. That's important for people with some kind of disability, for instance, ones that are using screen readers, because screen readers will read the text that's marked as a link. So using text like read more isn't very useful in that context. We also want to look at creating meaningful alternative descriptions of images, again for people with visual impairment, but also to improve the searchability of the collection, because things like Google search make use of alt text to help people find images when they're doing a text-based search. And so here's an example of Vernon Browser just with our demo site. We do work to create automated alt text on images. We do that by using the default page title for that particular object, and we add in the AI tags that Vernon Browser has added to give additional keywords that help people understand the context of that image. So here's an example of a record which was catalogued solely as yellow jug in the title, but we can see down in the middle of the page the other Google image tags that Vernon Browser has added to make that more accessible. In addition to this, you can override the caption on a specific image by using the caption field in the photo AV file of Vernon. So you may have 3 images of a particular object. You could override the caption of one of those to note that it's actually the reverse of the painting showing the signature, for example. Creating transcripts and captions, which Penny does for things like our user group meeting recordings. Providing clear instructions, and so that's important for when you're writing those cataloging guideline documents for internal use. Give all of your catalogers clear steps that they can follow so that you're going to get the best possible result out of the work that they're doing. Keep those instructions clear and concise. There's no need to be overly verbose when you're trying to explain how to do things. So here's some examples of link text, which is one of the things that you can most easily fix when creating web resources for your organization. So instead of just underlying simple words like here or read more or click here, you want to change that so that you underline the meaningful words in the sentence about that content. So find more about our visiting hours would make much more sense as a clickable link. That can link back to Vernon, where we were using the external file field. So we saw in that example before, we had notes recorded against those 2 links. In the publishing to Vernon Browser, we can publish the notes field and we can automatically make that the display text for the link. So you can then give careful consideration about the wording in those notes so that it's creating a useful link for the end user. If that link was going to a file, then you can be specific about the type of file and the size of the file that people should expect to download if they click on that link. And that's important if somebody's using a mobile device, because you don't want them using up a whole lot of bandwidth on a large file without giving them some warning in advance that that's going to happen. The next talk that we had in our closing session was by Taina Herzer from MOTAT, the Museum of Transport and Technology, which is based in Auckland. And she covered the work that they've done in the revamp of their aviation hall, a huge building on the MOTAT site, which showcases a number of the different aircraft that they have within their collection. As part of that revamp, they've looked closely at how they share information about those items within the gallery. One of the steps that they did was do paper-based prototyping. And that's something that you can use in a whole range of activities at your museum to test different concepts you have. So that's as simple as having pre-printed, cut and pasted designs where you get people to interact with those designs and see whether your assumptions are really correct. And so you can do that before you've invested all of the time in doing a proper design, or in the case of things like a web system or a collection management system, invested money in customization, branding, and design work. There are lots of resources on the web that explain the advantages of paper prototyping. Usability Geek is one of those sites, and it gives really clear examples of both how you can create paper prototypes, like this example where somebody's got an iPad just with a paper printout on top of it, and users are asked to interact with that, and you can watch them in person and see where they're trying to tap on. And it gives examples of why paper prototyping really helps both with budget management and creating the best possible result. That's something that we internally do at Vernon Systems. So one of the products that Penny uses is TreeJack, where we can create simple usability tests and send that out as surveys. So most recently, we did that with our new Vernon Browser help site, where we gave an example of the menu structure within Vernon Browser help, and then we asked people to show where they thought a particular example of content would be found within our tree structure. And that helps see whether the way that we're breaking down that content makes sense to the end user, and whether things like the headings and menu items are also clear and understandable. One of the things that came out of that usability testing is that people really wanted the collection to be brought to life. And so MOTAT did some work on their collection item doing things like 3D scans, so they could then show those aircraft actually flying in a virtual environment. So they scanned a number of the aircraft in their collection as 3D models, and then they hired an outside design firm to create small interactive videos to show those aircraft actually in use, even if they aren't flying today. They also rethought how they present different factual elements from the collection. A lot of those facts are recorded in the collection records in Vernon CMS, but they needed ways to bring those statistics to life, to provide interesting visuals for people to understand what all of those facts and figures meant. So here's a simple example where the altitude, that is the maximum flying altitude for these different aircraft, has been presented as a simple visual where we can immediately see what those aircraft look like side by side and see the comparative altitude that they can fly at. Lastly, all of this comes back to the collection management information. So MOTAT found that having detailed collection records, both in Vernon CMS and Vernon Browser, was a huge resource as they did the research into this revamp of the aviation hall. So it helped their team find items they were interested in, find related information from the collection, and discover things that wouldn't have been easy to find with the traditional cataloging systems they had. So Vernon CMS and Vernon Browser, both as a resource for the public and the staff within your organization, is a great way to get the most out of the collection you have and make it more accessible to everybody that's involved in that. So that covers a recap of the key topics that we had people speak about during our user group meeting. Thanks, everyone.